I'd like to welcome everybody to this online public meeting called for by the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. My name is Max Boddy. I'm the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP, and I will chair today's meeting. The title of our meeting today is A Socialist Program to Eliminate COVID-19, Become an Electoral Member of the SEP Today. We have called this meeting as part of our campaign against the nakedly anti-democratic electoral laws that were rushed through the Australian Parliament on August 26. Behind the backs of the Australian population, the Labor opposition marched lockstep with the Morrison Liberal National Coalition to push the laws through both houses of Parliament in less than 24 hours. They were aided by a wall of silence from the corporate media and virtually all other political organisations. Only our party has launched a campaign to defeat these laws and make the working class aware of their anti-democratic nature. The laws compel all federally registered political parties that do not have members of Parliament to submit a list of 1,500 members by December 2nd. This is treble the previous number. If this demand is not met, the SEP, along with 35 other political parties, are threatened with being stripped of their registration. This would deny any candidates of the SEP the basic democratic right to appear alongside our party name on the ballot paper during elections. It would prevent millions of people who voted for parties other than Liberal, Labor and Greens to vote for the party of their choice because they would be unidentifiable. In addition, the laws give the Australian Electoral Commission the power to prevent parties from registering, even if they've submitted the 1,500 membership list, if their party's name share common words such as socialist or communist with another registered party, unless they get written consent from the first registered party with that name. The Coalition and Labor parties know very well that support for their indistinguishable policies is dropping precipitously, and that the possibility of a hung parliament and a minority government in the next election is very possible. In fact, the only parties whose support has increased is the minor parties, which are subjected to these laws. The laws are the result of the profound crisis of the political elite and is a desperate attempt to maintain the two-party system of rule. The legislation's aims is to silence dissenting voices, to prevent the growing hostility to the continued degradation of the social and living conditions of workers and youth from finding a political expression. These laws were enacted during the most significant health and political crisis in the world since the Second World War, and give the smaller parties 3 months to win 1,000 members under conditions where for most of that time, it has been illegal to walk outside the front door in the most populous states. The reckless and premature reopening do not make the task any safer. As evidenced by the experiences internationally, the adoption of herd immunity by capitalist governments has resulted in millions of avoidable infections and death. We are in the second year of the pandemic, and already, with 2 months still to go, we have witnessed more deaths due to COVID-19 than last year. As of December 31st, 2020, the official death toll stood at just under 1,950,000. As of today, that number stands at 5,009,767. Almost 5 months after the first outbreak in New South Wales, the state has been almost entirely reopened. Despite opposition from epidemiologists, medical experts, and health workers that the predicted increase in cases due to the reopening will overload the already overburdened hospital system. As of Monday this week, 500,000 children and educators have been herded back into classrooms, which will set the stage for a massive growth of infection. In Victoria, where cases remain at some of the highest recorded 7-day averages of any state in Australia since the pandemic began, the state Labor government of Daniel Andrews is accelerating the reopening drive. Schools have started their staggered return this month, with all face-to-face teaching resuming by the end of next week. There is deep hostility to the reopening drive as millions of workers recognise that this will cause mass illness, hospitalisation and death. Essential to our campaign to defeat these electoral laws is a socialist strategy to eliminate COVID-19 globally. In opposition to the homicidal herd immunity policies and conceptions of living with the virus, such policies are incompatible with democratic forms of rule. On October 24th, the World Socialist website sponsored a public webinar entitled How to End the Pandemic. It featured a panel of distinguished scientists and workers who have fought for a policy of the global elimination of COVID-19 against furious opposition. The event outlined the necessary scientific response to COVID-19, how it can be eliminated, and outlined a strategy internationally for the working class to fight it. It sought to explain patiently and with great detail all the essential issues around the COVID-19 virus, such as how it spreads, the truth behind long COVID, how elimination is possible, and the devastating impacts of the virus on adults and children. The webinar was truly unique and a remarkable milestone. No other organisation outside of the International Committee of the Fourth International, either political or scientific, including the unions, have held such a meeting. This is despite nearly 2 years of the pandemic and dramatically escalating death tolls worldwide. In opening our meeting today, and to encourage everybody who hasn't already to watch the webinar at the conclusion of our meeting, we will begin with a short clip to give a teaser of the webinar.
Confronted with the reality of this continuing disaster, at what point does it become necessary to start referring to COVID not only as a pandemic, but as a form of social holocaust? We are approaching the beginning of the 3rd year of the pandemic. This webinar is dedicated to the proposition that it must be ended. For this goal to be achieved, it is necessary to understand the following. 1, the target of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is not individuals, but entire societies. The virus's mode of transmission is directed toward achieving mass infection. SARS-CoV-2 has evolved biologically to strike billions, and in so doing, it kills millions. 2, therefore, the only effective strategy is one based on a globally coordinated campaign aimed at the elimination of the virus on every continent, in every region, and in every country. There is no effective national solution to this pandemic. Humanity, people of all races, ethnicities, and nationalities, must confront and overcome this challenge through a vast collective and truly selfless global effort. 3, the policies pursued by virtually all governments since the outbreak of the pandemic must be repudiated. The subordination of that which should be the unquestioned priority of social policy, the protection of human life, to interests of corporate profits and private wealth accumulation, cannot be allowed to continue. 4, the initiative to bring about a decisive turn to a strategy directed toward global elimination must come from a socially conscious movement of millions of people. 5, this global movement must draw upon scientific research. The persecution of scientists, many of whom labor under threats to their livelihoods and even their lives, must be ended. The global elimination of the virus requires the closest working alliance between the working class, that is the great mass of society, and the scientific community. Governments won't listen to the scientists. They listen to the bankers. But the working people will listen to the scientists.
The system we used of having short, intense lockdowns had worked very well initially, but against the Delta variant outbreak, it was struggling. And the reason in the end that it wasn't able to contain this outbreak was that the virus became entrenched in very marginalized populations where contact tracing just no longer worked for a number of reasons. And this is the feature of the pandemic globally. It's a pandemic of inequality, and this is the problem. COVID-19 is so infectious, it won't be a seasonal disease. It doesn't need winter months to allow it to transmit because its reproduction number is so high, 6, compared with a low number for influenza. At the moment, as we're all seeing, is it's challenging to achieve and sustain elimination with our available tools. It will get easier in the future with vaccines that give what we call sterilizing immunity, like we do for measles and polio. So I think we'll see big advances here, but we know it's technically possible. The World Health Organization has elimination strategies for a number of diseases, and it does need one, or to at least consider one, for COVID-19.
It will be an underestimation to say that workers have been crying out for science-based policies to end the pandemic for nearly 2 years. In the United Kingdom, we've got a mass murderer as a prime minister who demands, as Dave said, that the bodies pile high in their thousands. The situation on London buses has shown what workers have faced during the pandemic. It has been a war on the working class and a war on science. The two go hand in hand. 70 London bus drivers have died of COVID, a rate nearly as high as for frontline nurses. Every one of these deaths is a tragedy, a preventable tragedy.
And they told us, over a year and a half ago, that basically they were certain that this disease was not being breathed in, wasn't going through the air, it was going through these droplets when people cough, and that they were too heavy to stay in the air and they fall to the ground. And maybe it was also going through surfaces. And they were so certain of this that they said to say that it goes through the air is misinformation. Okay? So they were so sure. Now, this is one of the biggest errors in the entire history of public health. Probably the clearest evidence is that transmission outdoors is much less than indoors. And this is one example from Japan, but there are many papers that show this. And in Japan, they followed 22 people who later found they were infected, but they had met with people indoors before they knew they were infected, and 88 who had met outdoors. And you see that the people who met indoors infected people more often than not, and infected large numbers of people often, while outdoors it was the opposite. And finally, I think there is one other reason that explains why, especially the measures don't change, even though they accept that it goes through the air. And it's because droplets and surfaces are more convenient for governments and for organizations and companies. Because if you get infected, well, you didn't wash your hands, you didn't keep your distance, you didn't wear your mask well, the responsibility is mostly yours. Well, if you get infected, but it was airborne, then your employer, your government didn't provide you with good ventilation, and they really have a horror of that.
Last count, it was 1 in 12 secondary school children, which is kids aged 11 and over. 1 in 12 have got COVID, and in primary it was 1 in 33.
And children who are contacts of cases don't have to isolate. So if I had COVID today, my daughter, it would be mandated for her to go to school tomorrow. I could not keep her at home because I would be threatened with fines and prosecution. And similarly, if somebody next to her became a case in class, we wouldn't be informed. We have over 50,000 children living with long COVID, of whom 11,000 have had symptoms for more than a year. So these are children, many potentially with chronic disability. So long COVID is sort of the hidden pandemic after the pandemic that governments don't seem to be talking about. Part of the reason I think they don't talk about it is that if they accept that it's real and problematic, they'll have to do a lot more to prevent transmission. Once again, we find great social inequalities. So people who live in most deprived areas are far more at risk, and people on low incomes are far more at risk. So once again, I wonder if this is another disease that has been dismissed because it's more common in people who are poorer, more disadvantaged people. And, it's a neurotropic virus. There are many autopsy studies that now show the virus in the brain. It is related to neurodegeneration. So brain degeneration, even in those with mild infection. Vaccination also helps preventing long COVID, which is something that isn't really talked about enough, because if you prevent infection, which vaccines do, and I know that protection wanes over time, but for, 5 to 6 months, they provide reasonable protection against infection. We see at least that much protection against long COVID.
And the reality of the situation is, I know personally, I have got letters saying, send your children into school or you can go to prison for 3 months. When I get letters from Wigan Council telling me to send my children in because it is a mild illness in children, people seriously need to wake up, because it's not. I mean, you've just heard what Deepti said. It's positively criminal. I cannot believe I'm on here having this conversation in 2021.
Right now, some argue that, rich countries getting boosters is stealing from poor countries, and WHO wants to put a moratorium and says donate to COVAX instead. We need to basically not just waive the patents, we need to break the patents and directly demand for tech transfers. And if they don't demand it, we should, in many ways, threaten to either sue them for it or directly just crack the formula. Sometimes it's convenient to say don't get political. And I understand why you say that, and why many people say that. But at the same time, public health is policy. Policy is politics. You cannot disentangle the very nature of these. We have to wield political power, or we have to know how to build the political advocacy and the movement necessary to enact these social justice.
Canada is a good example because we have 2 strategies in Canada. 4 Atlantic provinces have followed elimination strategy, while 6 large provinces followed mitigation strategy. And we can see how it went. So basically, here we see the gray lines are 6 provinces that followed mitigation strategy, and colorful ones is Atlantic Canada, so 4 provinces that followed elimination strategy. At the beginning of pandemic, each province closed its border, so basically controlled the travel, so made that everybody coming from outside a given province had to quarantine for 14 days. Then they make shutdown and drove cases to 0. So they stopped all the chains of transmission. So they didn't have any community cases. What happened here, New Brunswick, is interesting and it shows that really elimination or living with COVID is a decision, made by politicians. So what happened in sometime in summer, New Brunswick decided that they are gonna live with COVID. And here we see how it goes. Some people claim that, it's too late, it's not possible to eliminate now because we have Delta, because virus is everywhere. The math works the same. If we can bend the curve and we can bring our value to low level, we can eliminate. SARS-2 could be eliminated in richer, more wealthy countries in just 2 months, maximally 3.
And so we must ask, what are the material interests which block the implementation of policies which science has demonstrated are necessary? It's the interest of profit. It's the interest of private wealth accumulation. What are the social forces in whose interests science works? Is there a class in society whose interests intersect with scientific truth? That class is the working class, the great mass of people. The scientists have explained the pandemic. They have shown how it is transmitted and how that transmission can be stopped. But the challenge of the working class is to end it.
Well, I think those clips make clear just how powerful and remarkable that webinar was. And I do say again, I encourage everyone here who hasn't at the conclusion of this meeting to watch the full webinar. It goes for more than 3 hours. That was just a short sample. But today, to discuss these points and more, we will have 3 speakers. Comrade Cheryl Crisp, the National Secretary of the SEP, Comrade Sue Phillips, the National Convener of the Committee for Public Education, and Comrade Oscar Grenfell, speaking on behalf of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the IYSSE. After the reports, we'll open up for questions and discussion, after which I'll call for a collection for our monthly fund before concluding on some announcements. Now, our first speaker today is Comrade Oscar Grenfell. He is a member of the SEP National Committee and the national organizer for the IYSSE. He is a leading writer and contributor for the World Socialist website. Welcome, Comrade Oscar.
Thanks, Max, and welcome to comrades and friends. Now, the electoral laws that we're fighting are a frontal attack on the political rights of the entire working class, but students and young people are particularly targeted by the measures. Labor and the Liberal Nationals know that they're widely despised by young people who rightly view these parties as the corrupt instruments of big business and the banks. And the general growth of anti-capitalist sentiment is sharpest among the youth. The fact that this generation has no future under the profit system, something many already recognised, has been hammered home by the experiences of the pandemic. On every front, it's young people, together with the most oppressed and exploited sections of the working class, who've borne the brunt of this. In the first place, even though COVID infections in Australia have been fewer than in countries such as Britain and the US, a large number of kids, teenagers, and young adults have contracted this potentially deadly virus. Since the start of the pandemic, there have been 21,616 cases among children under 9, or 13% of all infections. In the 10 to 19 age bracket, 24,681 cases, or 15%. And of course, these figures are largely covered up by governments and the media as the drive to reopen the schools continues apace. The highest infection rate has been in young adults 20 to 29, with 34,788 cases, or 21% of the total. If you add it all together, 49% of all infections have been among people under 30 years of age. National data for hospitalisations by age group isn't available, but amid the peak of the Sydney outbreak, 3% of all infections among teenagers led to a hospital admission. If you extrapolate for the total number of cases, that's more than 700 teens who have become so ill they've needed hospital care. And we've seen it internationally, but also here. The official claims that young people don't die of COVID are a politically motivated lie. To cite just two tragic examples, Border Lasker, a healthy 27-year-old football player, died suddenly at his home in Western Sydney in August. And 2 weeks ago, a 15-year-old girl became the youngest victim of COVID to date. The infections are the direct result of governments refusing to implement the necessary lockdowns and restrictions. And now that they're dispensing with all safety measures in line with the let it rip policies around the world, young people are even more at risk. Hundreds of thousands of kids are being herded into the schools and young workers into the workplaces. The high infection rates among 20 to 29-year-olds are not only because of the mobility of that demographic, but because young workers are most likely to be in low-paid, casual, precarious, and unsafe work if they have a job at all. As the pandemic struck, young people accounted for 46% of short-term casual employees, but just 17.4% of all employees. They're paid the minimum wage, they don't know how many shifts they'll get, and during COVID outbreaks, they've either had their hours cut or in many cases, they've been forced to work in unsafe conditions. A few other statistics documenting the social reality: half of Australia's 25-year-olds are unable to secure full-time employment, despite 60% holding post-school qualifications. 1 in 3 young people are unemployed or underemployed, and the official youth unemployment rate, undoubtedly understated, is more than double the national average, currently standing at over 10%. But in working class areas, the figure's far, far higher. In the southwest of Sydney, for instance, the official youth unemployment rate is just over 20%, but the real figure is probably closer to 40%. And the plans of the ruling elite will intensify this social crisis. While they're reopening the economy and forcing the population to live with the virus, the corporations, their governments, and the unions are using this pandemic to ramp up pro-business restructuring. The watchword is for greater workplace flexibility. That means get rid of most of the permanent full-time jobs that exist and inflict the miserable conditions associated with the gig economy on an entire generation. This is already well underway. In a 2020 report, the Productivity Commission found that incomes for young people were continuously falling. According to the report, the income of 15 to 24-year-olds, when adjusted for inflation, had fallen by 1.6% every single year between 2008 and 2018. That is a 16% drop in a decade. That's the result of declining wages and also the freeze of unemployment and youth study payments, which haven't been increased despite the growing cost of living. Combined with a huge increase in property prices, this means that just finding somewhere to live is increasingly impossible. In 2017 to 18, 28% of young people aged 15 to 24 lived in lower income households experiencing housing stress. That's defined where 30% or more of household income is being spent on rent or a mortgage. And for 20 to 24-year-olds, the figure's even higher at 37%. That situation has only worsened during the pandemic. Median house prices have increased by almost 22% in the past year, with the median price in Sydney now approaching $1.5 million. So the vast majority of young people can forget about ever owning a home, and those who do purchase one will be saddled with massive debt for decades to come. The government promoted speculative frenzy in the property market is flowing on to increased rents. In June, CoreLogic reported that median rents were up 6.6% in a year. That's the biggest increase in a decade. The median weekly rent across the country is now over $470 for houses or for units. If you compare that with the maximum youth study payment of just $256 a week, or the job seeker rate, $320 a week, the impossibility of the situation is very clear. There are many more indications of the social crisis than we have time to review. A food bank report, for instance, late last year found that 65% of young people experienced food insecurity. It means they missed a meal because they couldn't afford it at least once a week. And predictably, these conditions for which governments are responsible are fueling a mental health epidemic. A report this month by the Black Dog Institute found that the number of workers aged 18 to 34 experiencing mental distress had increased from 15% prior to the pandemic to 30% this year. The report cited instability of working hours and conditions and a lack of social and government support during the pandemic as the major contributors. It's becoming clear to millions of young people that capitalism offers them no future. There's the social crisis, the adoption of murderous pandemic policies in the interests of the rich, and the other existential threats posed by the capitalist system, from the climate disaster to the danger of a nuclear war that would imperil humanity's future. The government and Labor know this opposition exists, and it's one of the central reasons that they've imposed these anti-democratic electoral laws. Just this month, Education Minister Alan Tudge noted a survey which found 40% of young people would favour an alternative to so-called liberal democratic governance. This was a catastrophe, Tudge said. Now, despite the misleading way the figures were presented, the issue is not that young people were hankering for authoritarianism or dictatorship, which is what capitalism has in store. Instead, the real problem, Tudge said, was the influence of communism and socialism was growing. His remarks were just the latest in a series of such comments. One could cite articles in the financial press warning that the fuel which ignited mass youth participation in the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions a decade ago exists everywhere, and also worried commentary on polls in the United States and internationally, repeatedly showing that a majority of young people favour socialism over capitalism. Young people want to fight for a future. We've seen that in the massive climate strikes of recent years and the widespread opposition to the dangerous school reopenings, including mass petitions initiated by high school students themselves. These laws are aimed at straitjacketing the youth and the working class in a capitalist two-party setup that offers nothing but war, austerity, and authoritarianism. Their purpose is to prevent any political alternative, especially a socialist perspective, from being advanced and discussed because the ruling elite knows that it could very rapidly win mass support. The issues facing the younger generation are revolutionary in scope, and the capitalist class is well aware that in every period of social upheaval, the youth have been at the forefront of the fight for socialist revolution. The IYSSE, the youth wing of the Socialist Equality Party, is calling on all young people and students who want to fight for a future to take up the struggle against these electoral laws. They're an attempt to suppress your political rights and to prevent you from accessing the socialist and revolutionary perspective that offers the only way forward. Become an electoral member of the SEP today, sign up your friends, help us organise meetings and discussions with young people, and become active in this campaign. And above all, take up the perspective that these laws seek to block. That is a socialist perspective aimed at refashioning society on a world scale to meet the social needs of the vast majority of the population, not the profit interests of a tiny corporate oligarchy and the rival nation states that advance the interests of competing cliques of the capitalist class. So we urge you to become involved in the IYSSE and also to apply to join the SEP as a full member to take your place in the fight for socialism. Thanks.
Look, thank you, Comrade Oscar. Our next speaker today is Comrade Sue Phillips. Sue is a member of the National Committee of the SEP and the National Convener of the Committee for Public Education, or CFPE. She is a writer for the World Socialist website and has fought for a socialist perspective among educators for more than 4 decades. Welcome, Comrade Sue.
Thanks, Max. On October the 5th, less than 4 weeks ago, the Committee for Public Education published a statement titled "Oppose the Dangerous Reopening of Schools in Australia, Form Rank and File Action Safety Committees." On the same day, we circulated a video via social media of educators speaking out against the Victorian Labor government and the New South Wales Liberal Coalition government's pro-business agenda of supposedly living with the virus, including the opening of schools, which has recklessly put lives of students, educators, parents, and the community as a whole at serious risk. Everything we warned about in our statement and video has been sadly vindicated, with surging infections in primary, secondary, specialist schools and childcare centres. In less than 1 month, more than 300 schools have been closed in Victoria and more than 150 in New South Wales. Together in the 2 states, close to 500 schools have closed, and we can say without any doubt, these figures are a complete underestimation. This data is not published by the government's media or the Australian Education Union or the New South Wales Teachers Federation, who are absolutely complicit in this dangerous experiment. In fact, all of them are working consciously to suppress information about how widespread infections are, fearing growing parent and teacher opposition. Members of the Committee for Public Education have been working diligently tracking the closures by collating hard-to-access public health data, following social media, and gathering reports from parents and teachers. It was only after the CFPE began exposing the alarming numbers via social media, and when thousands and thousands of parents and teachers began accessing and spreading our data, that the media, The Age, The Guardian and the ABC all of a sudden began highlighting some of the closures. The refusal of public authorities to publish comprehensive accounts of COVID-19 related school closures is just one expression of the extraordinary censorship that has accompanied the reopening drive. Basic public health data is being kept secret, including the number of infected teachers and school workers and the source of these infections. Some schools have had multiple infections and closed several times in a month. And now with the implementation of new guidelines, even when schools have infections, they don't have to close down, only single classes isolate. With the systematic lifting of health restrictions led by the Morrison's bipartisan National Cabinet, which is being implemented in the schools, is a policy determined by the corporate and financial elite, described as, quote, let it rip. Even in term 3, when schools in Sydney and Melbourne were largely working remotely online as part of lockdowns, with only small numbers of children of essential workers and other vulnerable children on school sites, over 200 schools closed in New South Wales and nearly 100 in Victoria. Despite these appalling statistics, and against all scientific and epidemiological knowledge and bitter international experience, governments have made clear that nothing is to stand in the way of opening up. In mid-September, Daniel Andrews, using language employed by Morrison and Berejiklian at the time, declared, quote, "We cannot permanently suppress this virus. Remaining closed forever has its own cost. We are opening up, no doubt about that. There will be no turning back. We have to normalise this. We have to pass through this pandemic. We cannot have a perpetual suppression of this virus. There will be pain. It will be challenging," he said. Now, in other words, schools must be opened up as the first step in opening up the economy, with children brought back to the classrooms in order for parents to be herded back into workplaces. A policy driven not by medical science, but by class interests, with the aim of maximising corporate profit without regard to health and safety. Any attempt at eliminating the virus through measures such as lockdowns is to be ended, and even the most basic health and mitigation measures removed. And this is being ruthlessly pursued. Term 4 in Victoria began with more than 50,000 VCE students, senior students, rushed back into school to sit face-to-face general achievement tests. This was completely unnecessary and led immediately to infections. A similar process was underway in New South Wales in term 3, bringing students studying practical subjects back on site. In the last weeks in Victoria, under conditions of skyrocketing and record community infections, reaching sometimes over 2,000 a day, the staggered school returns were brought forward with the implementation of new school guidelines lifting previous restrictions. The same process took place in New South Wales. Senior student examinations are to proceed no matter what. Even students who are a primary close contact of a positive COVID case are still sitting the exams on site, seated in a separate room with minimal precautions, supervised by staff wearing shields and personal protective equipment. In other cases, VCE students who are close contacts of other infected students have been given exemptions from self-quarantining to attend school. Schools are now doing their own contact tracing, with more than often only cohorts isolating. Deep cleaning has basically been eliminated, and only teachers who have had contact with someone infected for more than 2 hours needs to quarantine. Any less time, an hour and a half, quarantining is regarded as not necessary. This is being imposed under Delta, where a person can be infected within seconds. The Age reported last weekend school trials, where primary close contacts of COVID-19 cases will soon be able to return to the classroom if they record a negative 15-minute rapid test result. This will mean that schools will be responsible for collecting and managing the results of rapid tests, rather than the health department, this representing a shift away from a centralised testing regime towards a model where schools be left to make decisions that they are clearly not qualified for. This is what normalisation means, a dangerous and potentially deadly experiment where young children and teachers are being used as guinea pigs, where lives are regarded as totally expendable. Similar herd immunity policies have been pioneered in the US and the UK, and the results are devastating. Despite the lies and misinformation peddled by governments and media, the children are not infected as easily, that they don't spread the virus like adults, and they are at risk of serious illness and death. In reality, in every country where schools have been opened amid widespread community transmission of the virus, they have functioned as vectors. Just to give a very brief glimpse of some of the international data. In the United States, on average, 3 children are dying in America every day. Last week, a record 26 children died from COVID. More than a third of all US child deaths from COVID, that is 234 out of the 584 reported deaths, have taken place in the last 3 months. In the same period, over 2.1 million children were officially infected with COVID. From April the 1st, 2020 through to June the 30th, 2021, over 140,000 children in the United States have experienced the death of a parent or grandparent. Globally, it is estimated to have reached 1.5 million. In the UK, up to 20,000 children are now infected with COVID each day, and a total of 100 children have died. 1 in every 33 in primary schools are infected, and 1 in every 12 in secondary schools. 50,000 children are now living with long COVID, of whom 11,000 have had symptoms for more than 1 year. COVID is now the leading cause of death among children in Brazil. 1,518 children ages 10 to 19 have died in the first half of 2021. In Indonesia, in July, over 700 children died from COVID. Now, this criminal and horrific situation has led to growing opposition among teachers, students, workers, most sharply expressed in the school strikes that began October 1 and 15, led by parent Lisa Diaz and other UK parents. These strikes, featured on the World Socialist website as a part of the global online picket, are winning ever-increasing support from educators and workers everywhere, because they express the common interests of the working class internationally, putting lives before profit. Opposition is beginning to emerge here among teachers and parents, who are increasingly now contacting the Committee for Public Education, reading our material, looking to us for information and a way forward. Educators from specialist schools are making contact, who work with the most vulnerable children with complex needs. Highly specialised education workers who face the most difficult and unsafe conditions are being treated with utter contempt by the government, department and the unions. And parents who fear to send their children to schools, describing schools where windows don't open with no ventilation, and then others reporting heartbreaking stories of their 13-year-old son in tears before being sent off to school, fearing bringing home COVID, infecting his younger sibling. Significantly, the UK strikes are being organised outside the teacher unions, who internationally have fully endorsed the murderous policies of their own governments. From the beginning of the pandemic, they have unquestionably echoed and imposed every government announcement. The modus operandi of teacher unions on the schools reopening is say as little publicly as possible, post nothing on social media about the issue in order to block teachers from discussing their thoughts and experiences, present COVID safety as a matter for individual schools and teachers to address on a case-by-case basis, and attempt above all to silence and intimidate people opposing reopenings, above all teacher members of the Committee for Public Education. This is why the CFPE has fought for school staff to form rank and file safety committees in every school, independent of the unions. Democratic organisations to develop the widest public discussion on the dangerous situation in schools. Committees based on the most accurate, up-to-date epidemiological scientific research and the full release of all relevant public health data, including the number of infections in schools and the number of clusters attributable to the schools' reopenings. On this basis, rank and file safety committees can collectively develop necessary measures to protect the health and safety of educators and students, potentially organising industrial action and strikes, joining with other educator rank and file committees as part of an international network of workers' rank and file committees. The CFPE urges all educators and parents to contact us. We are becoming the organising centre for the formation of safety committees of parents, teachers and students. Report on the situation in your community school. Alert others to the dangers and join the discussion on the necessary collective and international response. And above all else, make it a decision today. If you're not an electoral member of the SEP, sign up to the only party fighting for a socialist perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Sue, for that really critical and important report. For our final and main report this afternoon, I'm pleased to welcome Comrade Cheryl Crisp. Comrade Cheryl is the National Secretary of the SEP. She was a founding member of the Socialist Labour League, the forerunner of the SEP in 1972, and has played a leading role in the Trotskyist movement in Australia ever since. Welcome, Comrade Cheryl.
Thanks, Max. And I'd also like to welcome everybody at the meeting today. Thank you for your attendance. I think the issues that are being discussed here are really of immense significance. And I know on August the 26th, when the Australian Parliament passed these new electoral laws, which, as comrades have outlined, required that our party, along with 35 others, without parliamentary representation, would have to provide treble the number of members to qualify for registration under the Electoral Act. We had to decide whether we would undertake to meet this requirement. It was, after all, and not coincidentally, a demand that had been made by the government under conditions of lockdowns in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, with infections soaring to levels not seen in the course of the entire pandemic, making it both illegal and dangerous for our members to campaign and visit contacts, a consideration that was not lost on the forces who passed the bill or the Australian Electoral Commission. After discussion, the SEP decided that we would undertake this campaign. And certainly we are fighting to increase our electoral membership to 1,500 members. We are also fighting for the repeal of these entirely anti-democratic laws. But we are not fighting for an orientation of our members or of workers towards parliamentary democracy. We harbour no illusion or faith in that form of rule. It is one, but only one, of the forms of class rule which exist under capitalism. There are others, and they are being brought forward most sharply in the United States, where fascist forces were incited and organised by Trump and his followers to overturn the 2020 election and to establish an extra-parliamentary fascist form of rule in the United States. And it would be an entirely false conception to think it couldn't happen here. But the outcome of the struggle in the United States, here, everywhere else, will be determined in struggle. And that struggle itself is bound up with the intersection of the Trotskyist movement and the growing upsurge of the working class, of which this campaign is a part. The SEP has a broader perspective. The campaign for our electoral members is part of the fight for the independent mobilisation of the working class and for the break of the working class from the confines of parliamentary democracy and all the organisations and political parties which perpetuate it. The fact that there is a growing opposition to the perspective of these governments, Liberal and Labor, which exists within the population and within the working class, threatens the very functioning of these mechanisms of rule and is of profound objective significance. I think our decision has been proven correct to fight for the electoral members and for the campaign against these laws. And the SEP stands alone in that campaign to defeat these laws. Within less than 2 months of the passage of the new electoral legislation, the Morrison government is now implementing laws which demand that voter ID is mandatory in order to vote. The purported reason is voter fraud. There is not one shred of evidence, let alone proof, that voter fraud exists, and that is admitted by both government and non-government members of parliament. This is again an attempt to prevent predominantly working class people, the elderly and the poor from voting. Australia, after all, is one of the few countries which immediately the pandemic hit, all but shelved parliament. The government ruled through the National Cabinet, an unelected body which could not be scrutinised because all its deliberations are secret. It is not subject to freedom of information applications, and it is in fact an extra-parliamentary form of rule that is dominated by Labor, state and territory governments. Parliament has rubber-stamped the National Cabinet roadmap out of COVID-19, which is itself implements the let it rip policy, so associated with the Johnson government in the UK, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Trump in the US, which is now being continued by the Democratic administration under Biden. All the states in this country, for varying periods of time, were able to eliminate the virus by public health measures of lockdowns, social distancing, masks, contact tracing, and quarantining. This has now, within a matter of weeks, been entirely dispensed with, spearheaded by the New South Wales Liberal government, but taken up and advanced by the Victorian Andrews Labor government, then the Queensland Labor government, and now the South Australian Liberal government. The reckless and dangerous policy of lifting all restrictions, opening up everything, including schools, is now resulting in the spread of the virus, most sharply in Victoria, but this will inevitably spread throughout the country. The outcome of this policy is both predictable and terrible. This has and will continue to lead to unnecessary infections and deaths and the suffering of thousands of people with long COVID. Not one political party in Parliament has opposed this. Where this policy has been implemented, as our other speakers have outlined, a human catastrophe has resulted, whether it is in the UK, the US, or elsewhere. Since Britain's so-called Freedom Day on July the 19th, there have been more than 11,000 deaths. In the 101 days since Freedom Day, 3.4 million people have been infected with the virus, bringing the total in that country to almost 9 million people. It's estimated that 1 in every 55 people in England has had COVID, up from 1 in 60 2 weeks ago. And this is the future of all countries that adopt this policy. Crises test all political parties, and this one is no different. There is only one political organisation that has fought for a policy of elimination of the virus based on science and the interests of society as a whole. That is the International Committee of the Fourth International and its parties, the Socialist Equality Parties. Every other organisation has either opposed this or accommodated to variations of herd immunity and mitigation. The online event that was held 1 week ago, the clip of which we have viewed, is one of immense significance. Let us remember that this pandemic is the greatest health, social and political crisis confronting mankind since World War II. Almost 250 million people have been infected and 5 million are dead, and these are wildly understated figures. Yet not one other political organisation, not one institution, not one think tank or government has held a discussion with ordinary people to explain what the virus is, how it developed, how it transmits, and how it can be stopped. Not one organisation. The International Committee and the World Socialist website held this online webinar, which brought together scientists who have, since the outbreak of the pandemic, fought for an elimination program in defence of the lives of millions. They appeared on the platform with workers who have fought in defence of the lives of children, bus drivers, teachers, students, and workers. Without this information, verifiable, scientific, and truthful, workers are unable to effectively mobilise to end this crisis. Such information is suppressed by the media, the trade unions, and political organisations. But the point which David North raised in chairing the event is that science alone cannot end the pandemic. It requires a social force for the scientists to align with that can undertake this task, and that is the working class. The online discussion established categorically that the pandemic can and must be ended. The measures not only exist to end the pandemic, but it has been demonstrated in New Zealand and China, even prior to vaccines, that it was possible. He said that it is not the characteristic of the virus that enabled it to spread unchecked throughout the world. Rather, the virus was working in a definite social and economic environment where decisions were made not to take the necessary measures. The decision in New Zealand and Australia to dispense with the necessary measures to stop the spread of the virus took place not because they weren't effective, but precisely because they were. Enormous pressure is now being exerted on China to cease its elimination strategy, and as the media crowed after the Ardern government did just that, to join the rest of the world. The priority for them is production and profit. When there is even one country in the world which disproves the mantra that one has to live with the virus, then it undermines that approach and that orientation. The ruling classes don't care about the infections. They don't care about the deaths. What they care about is the accumulation of wealth and riches. And if mass deaths are the price which must be paid by millions of people, then so be it. The virus cannot be eliminated without a global strategy. In their different ways and their differing experiences, the scientists outlined that. And that is something which is hidden from the world's population. Because in fact, truth and information are revolutionary issues. And the treatment of Julian Assange proves that. His unpardonable crime, a crime for which US imperialism, the British state, and the Australian government would happily see him pay for with his life, was to provide information to millions of people about the war crimes of all these governments. So those governments that have carried out these crimes against humanity are the same ones that are planning to extradite him to a 175-year life sentence in the United States, or, if necessary, to assassinate him. Assange is certainly not the first political prisoner to be jailed by imperialism. The most famous in that sense were Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian-born American anarchist workers framed for murder in the United States and condemned to death in 1920. This conviction led to the mobilisation of millions of workers throughout the world, including in this country, in New Zealand and others, in defence of Sacco and Vanzetti. But no such mass movement has taken place in defence of Julian Assange. Why? The central reason is the role of identity politics and the promotion of the entirely discredited and disproven allegations of sexual assault levelled against him by Swedish authorities. And in particular, the pseudo-lefts seized on these spurious and untested allegations as unchallengeable facts, demanding that Assange return to Sweden to answer for them, allegations which never became charges, knowing that if he was to return to Sweden, he would have been extradited to the United States to stand trial. Now that he is in the hands of the British state, these organisations say that they oppose his extradition after they have all but placed him in their hands by ensuring that he was vilified and separated from the masses of particularly young people who supported him. The role of the pseudo-lefts has been the same in regards to the pandemic itself and the electoral laws. Until the last few weeks, if one were to read the pages of Red Flag, Green Left Weekly, Jacobin and others, you would have actually been forgiven for thinking that there was no pandemic, there was no health crisis, there was no attack on democratic rights, and there were certainly no electoral laws. Socialist Alternative, in its belated articles on COVID-19, presented it from an entirely and utterly nationalist standpoint. In the course of the articles, about which they referred virtually only to the situation in Australia, not one politician, not one political party, not a union or a union leader, or even a government is named, let alone indicted for the policies that they have enacted. These aren't just errors or omissions, but a political perspective. That is to block any independent opposition of workers to the program of the ruling class in the political parties which represent them. These are the same organisations who promoted Victorian Labor Premier Daniel Andrews as a progressive alternative to the Liberal Berejiklian and Morrison governments. Andrews now leads the pack in opening up and eliminating all restrictions. Referring to the electoral laws, Socialist Alliance on September the 2nd wrote its first and only article on their passing, using it in part to assert their bona fides as the longest registered socialist party, therefore staking their claim on the name socialist. Neither they nor any of these other organisations have conducted any form of campaign against these laws. And it required a formal letter from the SEP to Socialist Alliance on September the 24th to obtain a statement that they would not use that veto, which they have now their power to do, on the use of the name socialist. Now, we don't raise our role as the only organisation that fights for elimination, that fights in defence of democratic rights, that fights for the education of the working class and for workers, for the unification of the working class on an international basis as a boast. It is the case. What other organisation plays this role? The party which fights for profit, for life over profit, for science over ignorance, for society over the individual, is the party which turns to and fights for the mobilisation of the working class on a socialist program. Between our first scientists webinar on August the 22nd and the second on October the 24th, the most important change which occurred was the upsurge of the struggles of the working class. This mass upsurge is taking place throughout many countries, but particularly in the United States. And they are characterised by the opposition of workers to the role of the unions. The fear within the Democratic Party and ruling circles is that the indispensable role of the unions in suppressing the struggles of workers and acting as the policeman for the companies and for capitalism is starting to break up. This is the outcome, certainly, of the treacherous role that these organisations have played in the course of the pandemic, forcing workers into unsafe workplaces, teachers and children into unsafe schools, healthcare workers into unsafe and unprotected hospitals. It is also, however, the result of the past 40 years of deteriorating wages, working and living conditions at the hands of the unions and the companies for which they serve. The opposition of workers to the unions is entirely progressive, justified and necessary, but it must be driven and developed by an alternative political perspective. The working class requires a leadership, and one with a program, an organisation and an orientation, a socialist perspective that fights to educate and clarify and creates the conditions for workers to take matters into their own hands. This means developing independent organisations, rank and file committees, independent of the unions, of the Labor Party and of the Democratic Party, where workers are able to speak to each other, collaborate with their international comrades and share information, experiences and lessons. That leadership is the International Committee of the Fourth International and the Socialist Equality Party. So it is for that reason that we are fighting against these laws and to win the new electoral members necessary to register. The Australian Electoral Commission is ensuring that this is made as difficult as possible. After it invited registered parties that are subject to these new requirements to apply for an extension of the 3-month period for which our party and the others have to gain the 1,000 new members, we submitted one based on the entirely justifiable protection of our members and contacts from the virus, not to speak of the illegality of campaigning under lockdown for new electoral members. This was summarily rejected on Friday, with the Commission saying that the electoral laws declared that the application for re-registration had to be submitted by December the 2nd. So we have 1 month to go. We have little time. So today we appeal to you all, those who are not yet electoral members, to sign up to our party. We appeal to those who are electoral members, fight to win new EMs to the Socialist Equality Party. But most importantly, we urge you to seriously consider joining the SEP as a full member, to fight to end the pandemic for a society which bases itself on the interests of mankind as a whole, of life over profit, against the drive to war, and that is a socialist society. Take your stand with the International Committee of the Fourth International to carry through what will be the most important decision of your life and the most important task which confronts mankind, and that is the fight for the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl, for that really critical and important report. We will now open up the meeting for questions and discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the chat I know that they've already had some questions and comments come in, which I'll read shortly, but these questions can be on anything at all. We've had 3 important and very detailed reports, as well as our short video of the webinar. So if you have questions on anything, detailed historical questions to factual questions, we'll take them and answer them. So just to go through, I see that Gina has written in the chat that young people, this was during Oscar's report, that young people are blamed for getting sick with COVID because we are told we're going out and seeing friends too much. It's because we're forced back to work due to casualisation of the Australian workforce. Important points there. I mean, so young Comrade John from the IYSSE responded, young workers are still being told that it's okay for them to go out and about as well, that it doesn't affect us in the same way it affects others. This is not true. Young people are increasingly impossible situation, low pay, insecure jobs, choose to go to work and risk infection, or choose to not go to work and risk not being able to find a place to stay or eat the food on the table. I think these are important points. We also have a question from Bridget, who says, it looks as though Australia has higher cases per million people than the world average. What is going on here that is different than the rest of the world, as we all live in lower density areas than much of the world? And then continues to say, I mean, it's quite worrying as everything is just opening up now. So it's about to get very worse. It's get worse very soon. And one more question that we'll take, and then I'll open up for panelists to answer. What is the party doing to counter pseudo-left identity politics and so-called culture wars that is diverting young people away from real social issues? So I'll open up. Who wants to begin to answer some of these questions and comments amongst our panelists today?
Yeah, I mean, the cases per million in Australia are not higher than others. The total cases per million of population in Australia is 6,500. I mean, obviously, you know, there's many countries. Sorry, I'll just that have far higher. In the United States, 140,000 per million. Brazil, 101,000. UK, 131,000. But the point that is I think raised by the question is that was undertaken by public health measures in particular, and it should not be there should not be any illusion that these public health measures, including the lockdowns, the closure of schools, these measures were the first choice of the government. These were the Australian government never adopted or adhered to an elimination policy. In fact, in March of 2020, Morrison's position was that Australia just needed to get out from under the doona. And the only reason that the lockdowns took place is because of the demands and the opposition to not instituting lockdowns, which were particularly evident amongst teachers, healthcare workers, and other sections of the working class. And in fact, that is a characteristic of the whole of the period of the pandemic in this country, one which was identified very sharply by the Murdoch media, who particularly this year and following the outbreaks which developed in New South Wales, railed against what they classify as the obsession of the Australian population with zero cases. That what was put forward is that Australians, like everybody else, had to get used to people dying, that they had to open up, that we couldn't live in a bubble, that there had to be an end to lockdowns, and in fact, the Berejiklian government spearheaded that. I think as we have outlined, the fact that that government refused for 10 days from June the 16th, when there were 2 cases detected in Sydney, and she refused to lock down for 10 days until the virus had spread, not just to the eastern suburbs where it began, but to the working class western suburbs. By the time the lockdown was enacted, and it was, as had been classified, a lockdown in name only, it was called a mockdown, there were over 100 cases, which then spread and developed to the largest outbreak that had taken place in the country since then, up until that point. And her government insisted and demanded that the lockdowns be as minimal as possible. The reason that Victoria is suffering the now what is the largest death rate and lockdown of this pandemic is because it escaped from New South Wales, it escaped from Sydney. The reason that New Zealand contracted the Delta variant is because it escaped from New South Wales. And so, the demand which was being highlighted certainly by the Murdoch media, by the Financial Times, by the Business Council of Australia, that the roadmap out, the end to lockdowns, the end of the pandemic had to be undertaken irrespective of infection rates or death rates. And that's precisely what has taken place. But where this ends is yet to be determined. Certainly in Victoria, the infection rate is still rising, and deaths are now rising. So this is a very conscious policy. But just to answer the question, it is not the highest infection rate or death rate. But nevertheless, that was because of the demands of ordinary people, and that was actually confirmed by state government, by state elections, which saw huge returns of any government, particularly in Queensland and West Australia, that were associated with strict lockdowns. And in that sense, that overturned what had been the previous experiences where the incumbent government would be thrown out of office virtually with every election. Both the West Australia and Queensland governments were resoundingly returned with landslides, and that's because they were associated, in that sense, somewhat wrongly, with the policy of elimination. So it's this policy, the overturning of lockdowns, of these restrictions, is certainly a very unpopular process which is underway, which has seen enormous opposition, particularly in regards to the reopening of the schools, but also amongst healthcare workers, amongst epidemiologists and others, where there is enormous concern about what the outcome of this could be.
Thanks, Cheryl. Comrade Oscar is indicated to also add to answering this question and the second question that we went through. Comrade Oscar.
Yeah, just briefly, and further to what Cheryl raised, I was taking a look just now at the total number of cases since the pandemic began, at various points. of this year. And so at the end of June 2021, there had been just over 30,000 cases throughout the entire pandemic in this country. The figure's now 170,000 cases. So that's 30,000 infections in the first 15 months, and then 130,000 in the past 4 months. So I think if you look at the figures, I mean, it's clear the sort of explosion of infections is completely bound up with what Cheryl was outlining. I mean, the response to the Sydney outbreak, the refusal to institute a genuine lockdown, which led to this virus running rampant, particularly in the working class suburbs of Sydney, and allowed it to spread to Victoria. And whatever the current fluctuation in case numbers, I think based on international experience, we can be very confident that this drive to lift all restrictions, force the population to live with the virus, is going to lead to further surges, both of infections and hospitalizations. Just briefly on the question of identity politics, I think it's a very critical one. How do we combat identity politics? Well, we politically expose its reactionary character through the World Socialist website. We explain that the politics of race, gender, sexuality, and other forms of individual identity have nothing to do with what's historically been identified as left-wing, progressive, let alone socialist. I mean, these politics are what have been promoted by the ruling elite at the universities and elsewhere for the past 40 years. They're fundamentally directed against a Marxist understanding of society. That is an understanding that class is the primary division and that the central task is to unify the working class, regardless of ethnic, religious, racial, or whatever other differences can be manufactured. I think, if you look at the role that identity politics plays, I mean, this is a central plank of bourgeois ideology. And we know Barack Obama, warmonger in the United States, who implemented the program of the banks and the corporations. His election was hailed by a whole layer of the pseudo-left as transformative, based solely on the colour of his skin. In office, he implemented a brutal class war program. The same with figures such as Hillary Clinton, Julia Gillard, in this society, in Australia. I think the other crucial aspect is the use of these politics to vilify individuals who fall foul of the establishment. There's the example Comrade Cheryl provided of Julian Assange. I think we described that as the first and most significant use of a Me Too style campaign to isolate, undermine a journalist who had won mass public support for exposing war crimes. The governments and others couldn't openly attack him because of his heroic journalistic work. They needed a smear, and that was taken up, promoted by this identity politics crowd and the pseudo-left. We've reported on many other instances in the United States and internationally associated with the Me Too campaign. I think just the last quick point I'd make is that above all, we identify the class interests that identity politics advances. I mean, these are the politics of an affluent layer of the upper middle class, sort of top 10%, who are seeking greater influence within the corridors of power, who are firmly entrenched in the upper echelons of the trade unions, academia, and the public sector. They have nothing to do with the working class, and they're hostile to the fight to mobilise the working class on a socialist program. So I'll just make those points.
Thanks, Oscar. There are some other questions coming in, and before I hand over to another comrade, I'll just read them out so comrades can prepare. There's a question from Stephen, who asked, can somebody explain on why there is a demand for China to end its eradication policies? Under these policies, its economy has grown, albeit slower than pre-pandemic, and when the living with COVID would destabilise the CCP. There's a question from Erica. Apart from the World Socialist website, has there been any other discussion on the war on science and scientists? So I will hand over now briefly to Comrade Michael, who is also a member of the National Committee and who actually put together that teaser video that you saw at the beginning and wants to make a brief point. So Comrade Michael.
Thanks, Max. It will be very brief. Just to explain this graph that's showing that was the sort of source of this question. I mean, the world figure there, well, we have to remember that China is a very large chunk of the world, and as well, another very large chunk of the world, India, has, certainly vast underreporting of cases. So if this graph were to show the United States, the UK, Germany, you would see that they are, in fact, vastly greater numbers of cases each day, most particularly in the UK at present, although I think the figures in the US at this point are, again, vastly underreported. So just make that point about this graph, that world can be slightly misleading in that sense, and just because of the size of China, which has, as has been discussed, is very much a different story to the rest of the world. But what's most notable about this graph is, if you look over at the right-hand side, the present and the recent past, the complete change in what's taking place in Australia and New Zealand. I'll just make those points.
I mean, I just want to make one brief point on the question. I know, it's been thoroughly answered by Bridget, but there's one point in there, in which she raises, almost kind of counterposing that there's this increase, but we live, or, in Australia, they live in low density areas in much of the world. That is that, there's sparsely populated areas of Australia. And I think just to make the point, one of the aspects of this virus, and I think Comrade David North made this point in the webinar, if you want to use no other term, I mean, the genius of the virus is in that sense that it attacks society, the way society operates. That is, it's spread through aerosols, through discussion, through interaction. And so what's happened and what's been proven in Australia, that, what may seem like low density, that is, small rural areas, in fact, have high density housing. And these areas are entirely vulnerable, particularly rural Aboriginal communities in this country, which when the virus was allowed to spread into these rural areas, in particular Wilcannia, in which at the time the Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, blamed the Aboriginal population, saying that they selfishly held a funeral, which was actually completely in line with the lockdown orders at the time. And it was the spreading into that area in these dense houses, overcrowded, very packed in which, it spread in that sense like wildfire, and then caused, not only deaths, but almost the entire community to be infected with no proper healthcare systems, ventilators. People were sleeping in tents to isolate. I mean, the number of people in a city or town in that sense does not preclude it from the virus reaching there, particularly under conditions where it's being allowed to let rip. And the other side of that coin, as comrades have emphasized, so I won't necessarily say the same thing, but a virus that attacks, how society operates and needs a whole of society response. That is, vaccines linked with public health measures. And as we've seen, the capitalist governments the world over, including in this country, are unwilling to do that. Profits before lives. So that's why there needs to be a mobilization of the working class, the social force capable of bringing in, these measures to stop and eliminate the spread of COVID-19 and the virus itself. So I'll open up. Are there other comrades who want to make some points on the other questions?
In answer to the question that Erica raised, I mean, there's certainly been some reports, and in fact, the nature website has undertaken a survey of over 300 scientists worldwide on the impact of their speaking out on COVID. And 15% of the 312 scientists that were surveyed have been the subject of death threats, and more than 60% have been subject to attack by email, by social media, by other forms for speaking out. And so there's certainly certain reporting. I don't think that, the political organisations have said nothing, certainly not in this country. I don't think in New Zealand. And so, again, we stand alone in regards to the defence of scientists and of science in the wake of this crisis.
Well, there is a comment that relates to the question in regards to China, which I'll read out before handing over to Comrade Peter, which I'll go through in a second. So the comment is, on the pitch against the elimination strategy of China, volleyed off in the New York Times, does this demonstrate an escalation in the drive to war with China, in that the original lie on the Wuhan lab can be weaponized further by obscuring the actual health measures enacted, thereby suggesting and promoting a conspiracy that China developed the virus as an attack? Now, to answer this question and the one that came up before, I'll hand over to Comrade Peter Simmons, who's the national editor of the World Socialist website in Australia, and has played a leading role in analysing the political and social developments in Asia and the South Pacific. So I'll hand over to Comrade Peter.
Look, I'll be brief on these two questions. To answer them completely would require, some time. I think on the question of the demand for China to end its eradication policies, I think the point that Comrade Cheryl made, the political aspect of this is a very important one. I think the very fact that China has maintained the policy of eliminating COVID within its borders, and the fact that it keeps re-emerging does point to the fact that elimination has got to be global. It can't be done on a national level. The fact that this is coming under attack, notably in the New York Times, but elsewhere, in different ways, is because China does present itself as the great counterexample. It demonstrates that it is possible, if the policies that it enacted were established globally, it is possible to eliminate COVID and pave the way for its full eradication. And so there is very definitely a political aspect to this. I think also, as we have seen with countries in Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Vietnam in particular, there is huge pressure being brought to bear by global corporations to force the reopening of economies, because their closure, the disruption caused to international supply chains by the closure of borders and strict measures, including shutdowns of transport and factories in areas that are affected, is impacting on the major economies. And I think there is also a very strong element in the demand that China reopen, behind this. We're yet to see precisely, but it's significant that some of the major voices for this include, big business mouthpieces such as Bloomberg. They're pushing for it. So I think there's both a political and an economic aspect to this. Under its policies, the economy has grown somewhat more slowly. I think that's bound up with not just the issue of growth in China, but also the issue of growth internationally. I mean, China is part of the world economy. The world economy itself is slowing, as I think Comrade Nick Beams explained quite well in an article that was published yesterday. On the second question, is this going to be rolled into, is the demand for the ending of elimination strategies in China going to be rolled into the Wuhan lab lie, the lie that China deliberately either created this or it escaped from the Wuhan lab? I think we're yet to see. I mean, it's possible that be the case. It's possible that the allegation is made that China knew in advance that this virus would have a devastating impact and therefore allowed it to rip around the world. I mean, there are all sorts of conspiracies which have been hatched. Of the Wuhan lab lie is one of them. However, in terms of the drive to war, I mean, which is mounting, this is just one aspect of, you know, the escalating campaign against China, which began with the Obama administration, accelerated under Trump, and is accelerating further under the Biden administration, demonstrating that the bipartisanship of this, the fact that the American political establishment, the capitalist class as a whole, is moving against China on all fronts, diplomatic, economic, and potentially military, is driven by the fear of the historic decline of the United States and the threat posed by China's expansion to its continued global hegemony. I think Taiwan, on which we've been writing, the fact that this has emerged, it would appear out of the blue. You know, if one followed these things, this year, Taiwan has suddenly emerged as the flashpoint of flashpoints, you know, for a war between the US and China. This is manufactured in Washington. The provocations which have been taken over this issue are deliberately exacerbating, goading China, in a sense, into taking actions. It is a demonstration of how advanced this is. It's also a demonstration of the fact that whether it's on climate change, whether it's on the pandemic, whether it's on the danger of war, there really is only an international solution and a socialist solution to, you know, these big issues facing the working class and young people at the time. And so I would join other speakers in urging anyone who's not an electoral member to become one, but above all, to become members of this party and take up the fight, this perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Peter. Now we've got more questions coming in and much discussion. I'll read out one more question before I'll briefly, you know, take literature in order, you know, while comrades think about their answer. But it's just one question from Ingrid here. It says, I have a question from my partner whom is feeling extremely uncomfortable with the forcefulness of the vaccine mandate in the Northern Territory due to being implemented on the 13th of December. We will be fired if we choose not to be vaccinated. Understanding the severity of the virus, the question is more of a moral dilemma and also uncertainty of pharmaceutical company capitalist gains. We are not anti-vax or science, just uncertain of our so-called political leaders' agenda in this time. What is your perspective on this? And I will very shortly hand over to answer that question. But just before we do, I do want to, you know, jump off from what Comrade Peter was saying. I mean, the appeal for you to join this party, and part of that is to bring your attention to the vast Marxist literature that we have for sale on Merring Books. Firstly, I want to point you to this pamphlet, Marxism by Lenin, in which Lenin introduces the reader to the most essential concepts of Marxism. that it's a scientific theory based on a dialectical and historical materialist understanding of society and the development of social knowledge. In this pamphlet, he then provides a brief exposition of Marx's development of the labour theory of value, and also Marx's unique and most significant contribution to political economy, the theory of surplus value. Now, this can be purchased on Mering Books. So it's mering.com.au in Australia. It costs, I believe it's $4 for the electronic version and $6 plus postage for the paperback version. The next pamphlet we have for sale or pointing to is The Global Pandemic and the Class Struggle and the Tasks of the SEP. This pamphlet contains the resolution adopted at the 6th National Congress of the SEP in the United States. It is an assessment of the development of the pandemic. It recognises that the coronavirus will go down in history as a trigger event, not unlike the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914, which sparked World War I. This assassination only accelerated inflammable historical processes that had been building up over a protracted period. And today, the COVID pandemic is creating conditions for an immense intensification of the class struggle on the world scale. And as we say in the resolution, the working class is confronted with a crisis for which there is no progressive solution apart from a revolutionary struggle against capitalism. And finally, the book, The Fourth International and Perspectives of World Revolution. This is the latest volume from the International Committee, which contains a series of lectures detailing the renaissance of Marxism in our movement in the period following the split with the Workers' Revolutionary Party, WRP, in 1985-86. The lectures analyse the significance of that victory over the Pablo-like tendencies and contains the analysis of the complex issues facing the ICFI and the workers' movement in the period following the split. The volume uses both internal and published party documents, including detailed source of material to show how political perspective and program are developed in a Marxist Trotskyist party. I do highly recommend and urge all our supporters and electoral members to study and read our material as an essential step in your political development. Now, this book is $33 plus postage if you want a paperback version, or $13 for Kindle. So I will now hand over to Comrade Sue, who would like to answer this question on vaccines.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I mean, I'll just be very brief. It's an important question, and it sort of has two aspects to it. You know, concern about the vaccinations, or not so much concern about the vaccinations, but concern that it is sort of the agenda being promoted by the political leaders, and the lack of trust in these political leaders. Just that on the second part of the question, I mean, it's absolutely true. Workers, and they should, fear the lies and misinformation that has been coming out of the government, and more than any time, perhaps in history, political leaders are not trusted. Everyone thinks, oh yeah, they just lie, and of course they do. A few months ago, I saw a health expert speaking about the vaccinations, and he said one of the problems about the hesitancy people had about the vaccination, of having it and so on, was because of political leaders. The people didn't trust them, and if they were promoting vaccinations, people put a question mark over it. But of course, we have written some really important statements on this question, and one that the person from the NT should read, if they haven't already. It's called "Oppose the Right-Wing Campaign Against Vaccination." Maybe one of the tech people could pop that in the chat. It was on the 29th of July, and it was a statement by the World Socialist website editorial board. And just to read a little bit of it, it's a really critical sort of analysis of why vaccinations are important. It just says the campaign being carried out against mass vaccination is thoroughly right-wing and must be opposed by workers throughout the world. under conditions of the global pandemic of the lethal virus, which has killed more than 4 million people, mass vaccination is an elementary requirement of public health and self-defense of the working class. And it just goes on. Even the presentation of the issue as one of, quote, vaccine mandates is false to the core, since it treats the issue of vaccination as if it's some sort of infringement on personal liberty. In fact, no individual has the right to infect others and endanger their lives. And it goes on and explains, you know, how public health, the safeguarding of public health is in a mass society depends on a whole host of regulations. And just another quote here. There is nothing in the least progressive about the campaign against vaccine mandates. It's based on appeals to ignorance, fear, and anti-scientific prejudice. Those who are campaigning against vaccinations by claiming they are intolerable violation of personal liberty are peddling anarchism and libertarianism, which is nothing in common with the interests of the working class. And in this statement, we point out that, you know, it is a question of discussing and educating those that are concerned about this, but we support mandating of vaccinations. And if workers refuse to get vaccinated, then they should be put on furlough, because they have no right. A worker who doesn't get vaccinated has no right to infect others. And just finally on this, one of the other things we point out in that statement is that many of the trade unions are opposed to mandating vaccinations. And one of the ones that's pointed out, the people are sort of opposed to this was Randy Weingarten. She's the head of the American Federation of Teachers. And while she was campaigning for the reopening of the schools, you know, touring the country and getting $500,000 a year to do so, she said that, you know, vaccine requirements, you know, shouldn't really be necessary. Everyone should feel welcome and safe in the workplace, so they shouldn't, vaccinations should be mandated. So, I mean, I hope that answers the question, but I think that statement is very critical. Just one other point on this question of scientists being witch hunted and so on. I read a report the other day about Chinese scientists within the United States who are being witch hunted, basically, and being accused of espionage, sacked, and so on. And of course, this witch hunt is obviously in preparations for, you know, US war against China.
Thanks, Comrade Sue. Sorry, we've got one more hand up from Comrade Nick Beams, who would like to speak just briefly on some of the questions that have been raised. Now, Comrade Nick is the former National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and writes, you know, extensively on economic issues on the World Socialist website. So I hand over to Comrade Nick. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, just to underscore the points that Peter made on China and add a couple. Firstly, the example of China, as even reported by the New York Times, there's been 5,000 deaths, population of 1.4 billion. As Peter said, that's a stark example for any worker who wants to say in the United States, where there's been, 700,000 deaths, what's the difference? Secondly, this policy, as the New York Times even is forced to maintain, has great support among the population. They say the regime needs to maintain a zero COVID policy to maintain its legitimacy. They also report on infectious disease expert from Shanghai, who suggested in the summer that China learned to live with the virus. He was attacked as a lackey of foreigners. There is great support. And the reasons I think for this support are important. China passed through one of the great events of the 20th century, the 1949 Chinese Revolution, a revolution involving millions. And that has left its mark. There is a sense of collectivism, of the problems that are faced by people are collective, are societal. not individual. Contrast that with the so-called Me Too movement. Even you look at its name, me, too, me, the individual. And that is very prevalent. This notion of individualism has been promoted, and for good reasons, because it's sort of filling a vacuum in a sense, or it's the way for it has been opened by the suppression of the working class over the last 40 years. And so these individualist, selfish philosophies, Me Too is not concerned with the position of working class women and never has been. It's concerned with the position of certain individuals within the arts, the entertainments, media, state apparatus, and so on. And its very name reveals what it is. The change that must take place and will take place, is the development of the working class. And as David North emphasised, this is a social problem. The virus attacks society. It requires, therefore, a societal response, a collective response, and the basis for that is coming forward now in the movement of the working class, which will push aside these selfish, individualist, right-wing positions which aid and abet imperialism.
Thanks, Comrade Nick. Well, look, there's been a lot of discussion today and your questions have been really helpful. And I will go through some more before the end on some of what's come up in the chat. But at this stage, I'd like to appeal to you now for a collection for the Socialist Equality Party's monthly fund and to donate to the World Socialist website. On your screen and in the chat, you will see how to donate today. If you're an Australian citizen, you can donate to the Socialist Equality Party. But for reasons beyond our control, very anti-democratic measures, if you're outside of the country, you can't. But you can donate to the World Socialist website, which again, you can see on the screen how to do that. Every month, we raise our monthly fund entirely from the working class and young people. We don't get money from corporations or the state apparatus. It is raised entirely from our supporters. We have met our monthly target for nearly 50 years, and the fund goes to maintaining the World Socialist website, the running of our social media platforms, and the contribution and the continuation of our work throughout the working class. But this work needs to be expanded, and for that we need resources. As we have discussed today, there is a virtual media blackout on these electoral laws. Moreover, the wall-to-wall coverage of the pandemic in this country as internationally tells the population that they need to learn to live with the virus. Our party alone is calling for a socialist program to eliminate COVID-19 in line with our international sister parties, in countries around the globe, as an essential and interconnected aspect of our campaign to defeat these anti-democratic electoral laws. So to break through this silence, we need to deepen our work, and your support and donations today are critical for us to do this. And as such, I appeal to you to give today the most generous donation possible. It can be a one-off donation, or you can make a pledge today to our monthly fund. I'd just like to urge everyone here today, if you aren't already, to become electoral members of the SEP and ask others, family, friends, and colleagues to join our campaign. As an electoral member did post, and I think it's really helpful, Mary in the chat, 16 and 17-year-olds can enroll to vote and therefore can become electoral members as well. So appeal to your grandchildren, children, friends who are 16 and 17, get them to join our campaign and take up the fight to get more electoral members themselves. Anyone who agrees with the program and election policies of the SEP and agrees to support campaigns for the election of our candidates are eligible to join, but they cannot be a member of any other political party. That is a requirement not just of our party, but also of the Australian Electoral Commission to defeat the agenda of the ruling elite that places profits before lives. The working class requires new leadership based on the strategic experiences of the international working class over the past 2 centuries. The assimilation and understanding of this history, a requirement for full membership of the party, is detailed in the party's statement of principles, which you can see on your screen. It's $5 plus postage and handling. We urge all attendees today and electoral members of our party to purchase and study our statement of principles and consider making the most important decision of your life to join as full members of our party. To defeat these laws and ensure the party remains registered, we appeal to all our readers, supporters, members of rank and file committees, including the CFPE, our electoral members, students, youth, and all working people. Help us to recruit the extra 1,000 electoral members, to retain our party registration, and to take forward a genuine socialist alternative into the emerging struggles of the working class today. I'd like to thank our speakers again, comrades Oscar, Sue, and Cheryl. And again, thank you all for your attendance and discussion. It has been invaluable and very helpful. Now let's take this campaign forward and defeat these laws. We'll also leave the chat up, so anyone who wants to get any of the links, it will remain up for about 5 to 10 minutes. But thank you again, everybody.